Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Cryptodamus Astrology channel once again. Thanks for joining us today, and I'm really excited to have a special guest astrologer once again this week with Nick Dagan Best. He's a very well-known astrologer with over 2 decades of experience in the practice and study of astrology. He's kind of famously known as the human ephemeris, and he's written a well-known book about Uranus and the USA. I think it's titled Uranus USA, and he is currently writing a second edition of that. Is that correct?
Yeah, preparing it anyway. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we'll be definitely awaiting notice of the publication of that. And we're here to just talk about some of the upcoming and ongoing astrological alignments. As usual, we do a little forecast, and my format on my show is really I like to pick one or two of the most notable astrological events that are coming up and try to break it down and really analyze it, either myself or with other astrologers on here. And our previous show, we had the astrologer Gemini Brett, and he was talking about Venus Cazimi in Libra, which was a huge event. And today we're going to talk about a couple of things. Actually, Nick is going to talk a little bit. He's going to give us a different take on Venus Cazimi, and with a little bit of historical and mundane analysis, as well as Jupiter's retrograde ingress back into Pisces tonight. And then we'll also talk a bit about this extended Mars retrograde period that's going to start in a few days going into mid-January. So we've got a lot of things upcoming here. I would say this is kind of one of the more dramatic energy shifts of 2022, really, because Jupiter changing signs is kind of a big deal, and then that's closely followed by Mars changing directions. So that's a real energy shift there, and I think it has a kind of a backwards tilt to it, right? Because Jupiter's going back into the sign it was already twice before, and then Mars is changing signs and starting to move backwards as well. So there's a backwards moving energy that I think is going to be quite challenging. It's not necessarily bad, right? We may have unfinished business that we need to clean up and take care of before we can move forward. Moving backward isn't always bad, but sometimes it can be stressful or challenging. And then, of course, we've got that eclipses. We're in the middle of the eclipse season already, and those will be quite challenging and stressful as well. So, especially Jupiter and Pisces, as some of my crypto followers, my cryptocurrency financial astrology followers know, Jupiter and Pisces has been quite bad for Bitcoin and cryptocurrency markets in the previous periods, which were May through July of 2021, and also essentially January through May of 2022. I'm just going to throw up a chart before we talk with Nick. I'm just going to throw up a chart of the Bitcoin, one of my Bitcoin chart correlations here. Just give me a second. I actually should have had this thrown up, but just want to look at that. There's something about Jupiter and Pisces that's just really antagonistic to cryptocurrency markets. Even though Jupiter has dignity in Pisces, it's kind of interesting because we thought that it would have been better in some ways, and it makes favorable aspects to the Bitcoin natal chart. But that didn't seem to matter because in both instances here, the markets crypto and Bitcoin was specifically down really big. You can see the weekly chart here. Pisces is a more spiritual sign. It's not a wealth sign. It is a sign that is kind of transcendent of the material world and material wealth. It's in my, I do recognize the Jupiter rulership, but I also think there is that strong kinship with Neptune and tend to be more transcendent of material wealth in the material world. And certainly we saw that in the crypto markets here in 2021 and again in 2022 with really strong sell-offs. The stock markets were not quite as badly hit, but in 2021, but they were in 2022, also not liking Jupiter and Pisces. And also, of course, Jupiter and Pisces was kind of synonymous to some degree with the war in the Ukraine, which I know that Nick is going to talk about a little bit more. So that's happening tonight around 10 p.m. And that is Jupiter is going to only go back into Pisces for about 6 weeks or so till right around the solstice. And then Jupiter's going to ingress back into Aries really for the real ingress into Aries, it's gonna be in Aries for good and make the whole transit of Aries into, I believe, May of 2023. So that's the situation with Jupiter. Um, so Nick, I think you wanted to start with just going back a bit and looking at that Venus Cazimi in Libra, which was the first one I think in over 100 years, and that was kind of a big deal. So is that
The
what you
first
want to
one
start
in
with?
Libra, the first one in Libra in over
Yeah.
100 years. Yeah.
Yes.
We get a Venus Cazimi every
In
9
Libra.
months.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, but yeah, in Libra in 100 years. Yeah, the way that cycle works is with every 8-year Venus return, it's always about 2 days and 2 zodiacal degrees shy of a full 8 years. So that gradually over time, like, this time the Cazimi was at 29 Libra. 8 years from now, there'll be one at about 27 from Libra, at 27 Libra. And 8 years after that, there'll be one at about 25. So that over time, eventually it wanders into Virgo, and then, 100 years later into Leo, and so on and so forth. But you can also follow, if you sort of, apart from the signs that these Cazimis happen in, this particular Cazimi, which there are 10 of them, 5 exterior, 5 interior. That's probably something that Gemini Brett covered. But this
And
particular,
you covered this, I believe, with an episode on the astrology podcast with Chris Brennan.
I have talked about it. So for those of you who've seen my diagram of the Venus synodic cycle, this particular period, this Cazimi, and the period that surrounds it, in my system, 73 days prior to and following the Cazimi, what I call the blue 2 interval of the 20 Venus intervals. This has a very rich history in wartime. The War of 1812 between your country and mine, that ended in a blue 2, as did the First World War in 1918, ended very close to this blue 2 Cazimi. And there's another war as well that's escaping my memory right now. But the other thing, besides wars ending during Blue 2, there are other wars during which the war didn't end, but there were tremendous bloody battles where the army that was the underdog wound up doing better than the more powerful army. This would include, ironically, the Soviets were the underdogs when they fought the Nazis in Stalingrad in 1942 going into 43,
Right.
which was during the same
Right.
blue 2 interval.
Well, that's kind of interesting. If I could just interject, because I think it's interesting that you mentioned that, because to me right now it seems like it's Putin's invasion of Ukraine is almost eerily similar in some ways to Hitler's misadventure into the Soviet Union in the 1940s. There's a lot of similarities there.
If you really go into Russian military history, there's so much about this war that's like every war Russia has ever fought. That's the crazy thing. You were talking about the Jupiter, in Pisces. When we had the conjunction in Pisces back in April, that was the first Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Pisces since 1855, literally during the time that the Russians surrendered and, surrendered and signed a treaty ending the Crimean War. Like talk about the history repeating itself. And the Crimean War, which they fought against the British, the French, and the Ottoman Empire, they really lost that because they were so behind technologically. They didn't have any trains yet. They didn't have any telegraphs. The British and French had all that stuff. So it's like, even in the sense that right now Russia is so sort of behind technologically, even though they claim to be advanced. It's just all the parallels go back to that.
Well, logistically, they're certainly not functioning well.
No. They don't have roads. They're doing everything by rail, which is what they, would have been like being ahead of the curve back in 1855. But it's really being behind the curve now. Two other wars that had battles where the underdog did very well. One was the U.S. Civil War. Although the Confederates lost, they were definitely the underdogs in terms of the number of men they had, the equipment and money to their availability. The Union had just more people, more money, more weapons. But the Confederates did do very well at the Battle of Fredericksburg, to the point where Lincoln was really sort of panicked, more panicked than he ever was. He usually kept his cool. And also, actually, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed during this Blue II interval as well. And the other battle that's kind of like this is a famous battle in South Africa between the British Army and the Zulu warriors, the Battle of Isandlwana, where the Zulus with spears, just massacred British with guns. So yeah, sometimes you can bring a knife to a gunfight and win, which is what they did. So in other words, these are the patterns. Sometimes wars have ended, like for instance, the First World War, the War of 1812. These big sort of sweeping wars that end really suddenly, when people expect them to go on longer, actually. And then also just these battles that involve a sort of a smaller force, overtaking a stronger one, even though in most cases, the Zulus didn't win the war with the British, they won that battle. Same with the Confederates, they didn't win the war, but it was a very strong time for the army with the fewer men, fewer resources, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, I wanted to interject that because that's an interesting thread that runs through the history of war. And since, most people alive, we're not used to, our ancestors lived through all kinds of wars like this, right? I mean, all of our grandparents, our great-grandparents, this kind of thing used to happen a lot, but it hasn't happened in a long time. So it's, I think, important to reconnect to the history of all this.
So how does that bear on today's conflict in the Ukraine, in your opinion, astrologically?
Well, I mean, yeah, the Soviets are not the underdogs this time. Up against the Nazis, they were. At least without Lend-Lease, munitions helping them. But for the most part, the Russians always win their war with just manpower and not with technology. Just throwing as many bodies into a battlefield as they can. And that's, clearly what they're doing now. They're bringing in all this cannon fodder, these poor Russian guys,
Yeah. There doesn't seem to be any end in sight. Do you see anything that indicates the war coming to a resolution?
The great thing is, Biden's Saturn is at 8 Gemini, which is where Mars stations direct in January.
Mm-hmm.
And that is one of Mars transit to natal Saturn, typically, especially for a diurnal chart, typically sort of removes a boundary, removes some kind of thing that's in the way. You overcome some kind of obstacle. It helps you overcome Saturn, if you will. And it puts a stop to things, that need to stop. So it's typically a pretty fortunate transit. Biden has it in January, just as we get to the next Mercury retrograde. And that Mercury retrograde in Capricorn, it recalls, excuse me, again, the next Mercury retrograde station in Capricorn recalls the Venus-Pluto conjunction that was in effect when this war began. Venus went retrograde at 25 Capricorn leading into the war. And so this Mercury retrograde sort of brings us all back to square one in some sense. Yeah. So I think in January, we definitely, we're definitely on a new page. I don't know if the war full on ends then, but it's a very different scenario from then onwards. And much as the Russians have already been at a disadvantage so far, I think in January it's a whole other sort of level. And Putin's life, the next summer, in the summer of 2023, we have a Venus retrograde in Leo. That retrograde, that star point used to, and the kazimi happens in Leo. It used to happen in Virgo. Now, over the course of Putin's life, that retrograde, which I call a red 5 interval, that Venus retrograde in Leo, that has always been huge in Putin's life. And I'll just go through a quick list for you. In 1911, his mother was born during that Venus retrograde. In 1975, he graduated from university and joined the KGB in the summer of 1975, during that retrograde. 8 years later, during the summer of 1983, he got married. 8 years later, in 1991, during the uprising in Moscow, he quit the KGB. 8 years later, in 1999, first his father died, and then right when he was getting back from his father's funeral, he gets called into Boris Yeltsin's office, and he's named Prime Minister of Russia. And that was the first time any of us ever heard his name in the news. It was the day of this huge, you might remember it if you were studying astrology in 1999. In August 11th of 1999, there was a grand fixed cross eclipse with like Saturn in Taurus, Uranus in Aquarius, Mars in Scorpio. I mean, it was a massive malefic eclipse with the Venus retrograde in Virgo, this same Venus retrograde that is always huge in Putin's life.
Interesting.
And even just back in 2015, during the last retrograde in Leo, this was when, as the retrograde was ending, Putin and Obama were both at the United Nations on the same day, and Putin basically sort of humiliated Obama with his speech, and sort of, was very, kind of smirking and yeah, the teeth were starting to show at that point.
Yeah.
So this was in the aftermath of Syria and all that stuff. Anyway, my point being this, look at the record of Putin's life. I mean, joining the KGB, leaving the KGB, the birth of his mother, the death of his father, his marriage, all these things fall in the same little interval, the same little window of time that comes up just once every 8 years for a couple of months, a few months. I think wherever Putin's going, the sort of the climax is likely to come next summer. That just seems to be the big moment for him. On, and it's reasonable to surmise that the summer 2023 will be, probably his downfall is what I'm imagining. But
I'm actually going to throw his natal chart up here, and
sure.
I don't have the birth time. Since we're talking about Putin, I've been also looking at his natal chart. I'm fairly convinced that the October 7th, 1952, which I've confirmed in both the Western and the Russian media, I'm fairly convinced that this is the correct date for him, although there seems to be a lot of disagreement about this. The time, of course, is completely unknown. I have no idea. I ran it for 9:30 a.m. Yeah. But I think.
Well, can I tell you just a little bit about the birthday and the controversy, just
Sure.
For your listeners who might not know. Now, the 1952 chart, I mean, the thing that really speaks to me about it is that Saturn-Neptune conjunction, because Russian history is just full of Saturn-Neptune conjunction events. And
I was going to ask you about that next.
Yeah, Stalin died just a few months after, this chart. Stalin died in early March of 1953 during that same the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. And there's a lot of other events. The fall of the Berlin Wall, things like that happened during Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So it does tend to be a big thing. The controversy with Putin's birth, it is worth at least knowing about. The story is that he's Georgian, that a Georgian woman whose last name is also Putin gave birth to him, but she couldn't afford to raise him, and she gave him to relatives of hers in St. Petersburg who were also named Putin, and they raised him as their own. And there are actually apparently school records that they found in Georgia of an 8-year-old boy at the time named Vladimir Putin. So there is there is a little bit of a possibility there, but you want to know the most interesting thing about this story, whether it's true or not. If Putin was born in 1950 instead of 1952, it would mean that he is also born during this blue to kazimi interval that I'm talking about. Just like, in fact, Biden was born during this blue 2 interval that I'm talking about. But what's especially interesting—
Can you just remind me what the blue 2 means?
It's the kazimi, the name I give to the kazimi that we've just gone through. Right now we're in the blue 2 interval. The interesting thing about all this is that Stalin lied about his year of birth his entire life, and we only learned the truth in the 90s when the records became available. You can even see, like, in an old book of Liz Green's, she talks about Stalin having, Mars and Scorpio, because she was using the wrong birth year, the one that he gave. He gave 1879. He was really born in 1878, and he was really born during a blue 2 interval as well, which is what Putin would be if he's lying about his birth age. And it happens to be what Biden is. And this is a period that only comes up every 8 years, and that's where we are now.
Well, here's what I think. Here's what I mean. This is just recent, just only over the last couple of months, but I think that this clearly rectifies the day and the year. Now, I could be wrong. It might be coincidental, but if you go back and you look at the lightning reversal and the Ukrainian forces making the lightning reversal victory and taking back that 700 square miles and defeating the Russian military, that just happened recently. Saturn was at 1945 Aquarius when that took place, in an almost exact square to Jupiter at 1945 Taurus. Now, is that enough to rectify the day? Okay, maybe. Now, here's another thing. Look at this. Not only that, but if we look at the progressions, it turns out that his transit Saturn, once again, transit Saturn at 18 Aquarius was also conjunct his progressed Mars at 1846 Aquarius. Now those two things happen almost simultaneously because his progressed Mars is actually in that square to his progressed Jupiter, right? That to me is pretty clear rectification, because that's like, his luck was blocked. His grandiose plans for expansion of the greater Russia, as signified by Jupiter in Taurus, real estate, expanding your real estate holdings of your nation, was completely thwarted by this square to Saturn. And so I have much more confidence in this chart now. Now, also, I don't have that chart up, but interestingly, at the same exact moment, Nick, I don't know if you noticed this, Zelensky has a Venus Cazimi, natally at 5 Aquarius. Well, Jupiter in Aries was at 5 Aquarius, exactly sextiling that natal Venus Sun conjunction. So his luck, he's kind of naturally lucky guy, was activated by that favorable Jupiter sextile, while Putin, was basically thwarted by these Saturn conjunctions and squares. So that really was I posted that to all my subscribers, by the way. So you should, if you like that kind of information, check out my Patreon. But I think that Putin is basically, the point I wanted to make is Putin is really screwed right now with Saturn stationing in 18 degrees, which it still is, because it's on top of his progressed Mars and making that square to Jupiter basically for, the next 4 or 5 weeks or so. And, when it starts to move away from that position, it's also opposing his natal Pluto, of course, blocking his power and influence. People say, oh, well, of course, Putin has an astrologer. If he does have one, is a terrible astrologer, because this was a terrible alignment for any kind of high risk invasion activity. But
I think it's very doubtful he has an astrologer.
I think so too, based on what I'm seeing here. He needs one. It's more likely, but he needs a court astrologer to help him out here, because obviously this was not a good year for him with this T-square from Saturn alignment on his Pluto, Jupiter, and progressed Mars. But that's going to shift for him, as Saturn moves farther into Aquarius and then of course into Pisces. That kind of, those limitations may ease up. So that's a bit more concerning just in the kind of, going into 2023. Now I have to do a more long-term analysis, but the thing that seems to be holding him in check right now and keeping him in a limited position on the battlefield is Saturn. For now, I think he continues to be thwarted for the rest of 2022. And that was just basically what I wanted to add to that. I don't know if you have a different opinion about that, and then, with Mars retrograde and in a square to basically Neptune, an extended square to Neptune for, the next 5 or 6 weeks, nobody's going anywhere. I think the battle lines are kind of getting frozen in this, the famous Russian winter. And I don't think we're going to see a lot of movement. And that's why the Ukrainians really wanted to make some progress very quickly before that happened.
There's been a whole sort of time window for them to get this done, because I mean it's
Yeah.
infamous.
Yeah.
Fighting wars in that Russian-Ukrainian winter,
Yeah.
you know, took out Hitler, took out Napoleon.
Especially with
Not
Mars
that others,
retrograde.
yeah,
Not helping.
exactly. You know, Kiev was first sacked by the Mongols in 1240 when Moscow was barely a village. So this is not Kiev's first, you know, rodeo.
Right.
I mean, yeah, I mean, every powerful army in the world has gone through that part of the world. I mean, that's who the Russians are. Is they're part Vikings, part Mongols, part, you know, they were conquered by all of them, and they sort of they've retained more of those traits. You know, they often say that when the Mongols invaded a culture, they usually took on the qualities of that culture, whereas when they, you know, took over the Rus just became like the Mongols. So yeah, these are old
Well, you know, hey, speaking before we change subject to something else, I just wanted to ask you. So you mentioned the Saturn conjunction to, you know, Neptune as being very critical alignment in Russian history, and of course we have one coming up. You know, I mean, by sign starting next year, but an actual technical conjunction would be, I think, in 2025. No, 2025. Okay, I don't think it's actually not even in Pisces. I think it's 0 Aries, but in any event, how do you see that playing out? Could that be a time where Putin falls?
Oh no, I think he'll fall before that.
But you think he'll fall before 2025?
I think he'll. Oh yeah.
What, based on what specifically?
Based on the Venus retrograde cycle that I was talking about a few minutes ago.
The Venus in Leo next year.
That one just tends to be the point in his life. Every 8 years starts a new chapter. You know, everything I outlined for you.
So you think the Putin regime is very you know, has a short shelf life here now at this point?
Yeah, but I mean the thing is, it's not just, you know, it's not just Putin. You know, if Putin falls, it doesn't mean, you know, there are loads of people in Russia who still want to bomb the hell out of Ukraine. You know, Putin would just sort of fall because he's been so unsuccessful. And then the other thing is, by the time we get to the thing about 2025 is, I think that's a bigger fall at that point. In 2025, we get the next Venus retrograde in Aries. And that one has a long history of assassinations in Russian history, starting with, well, Catherine the Great was born during that retrograde, but she had her husband murdered, and then her son was murdered after she died. Her son was murdered during that retrograde. And then a number of other, there's one other czar who was assassinated during that retrograde. Other political officials, and then even when the last czar was assassinated with his family in the basement by the Bolsheviks, that wasn't during a Venus retrograde in Aries, but 2 of the 10 people shot in that basement were born with that natal retrograde, and most of the people shot in that basement had natal Venus retrograde.
Wow.
So there's that Venus pattern really comes out a lot in Russian history. And those are the periods I'm really looking for the twists and turns in the story. One thing I could imagine is next 2023, next summer, is when Putin falls from power, or that he's really undermined in the war effort. But 2025, when we get the Saturn-Neptune conjunction and then that Venus retrograde in Aries in the same sign as the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, that's when everything really truly ends, no matter who we're fighting at that point. Because as you probably know, I mean, you know.
Okay, you're on record now.
Yeah. I've been studying Russian history for a long time.
I should say that Nick is he's quite the expert in Venus retrograde. In fact, I believe that you did an entire show on Venus retrograde on the astrology podcast some years ago.
Yeah, I did. It comes up a fair amount. It's, I mean,
my viewers could go back and check that out if you're interested in Nick's work on Venus retrograde specifically. Go back and check out that the astrology podcast.
I'm about to release a new video on the Venus synodic cycle, which includes the retrogrades and everything. So I've got a new video I'm about to drop in the next few days. Maybe everyone check out my YouTube channel, subscribe, and get ready for that video to drop, because it really takes people, you know, like you were wondering, what do I mean by blue too? Well, this video will explain all that.
Okay. Well, let's, I didn't realize we were going to go so deep into the Russian situation, but shall we move on to the next topic
Please.
here?
Yeah.
So you know, Jupiter goes into, as I said, Jupiter goes into Pisces tonight, and we kind of led with that a little bit. You know, of course, the traditional astrologers, you know, I'm kind of I'm like a non-sectarian astrologer. You know, I mean, I was coming up in the late 90s as a more modern astrologer and really interested in Jungian, you know, Jungian astrology, especially like, yeah, Liz Green and Howard Sasportas and people like that, and Lynn Bell and people like that, like Jungian psychological astrology, modern astrology. But of course, in the last few years, I've definitely become more interested in the traditional astrology. I still use the traditional rulers. Jupiter, of course, is the traditional ruler of Pisces. So going back into Pisces, he will regain some dignity there, essential dignity by rulership. You know, I like I said at the beginning, I also think that there is a great kinship between Pisces and Neptune. And of course, Neptune is in Pisces now, and Jupiter and Neptune will get very close once again here. Now, in financial astrology, this is associated with the inflation cycle. And so Jupiter and Neptune in Pisces likely is not going to be good for the inflation situation. And we are having a 40-year high in inflation around the world. It's the #1 economic problem. Also, Jupiter in Pisces tends to favor oil prices rising. So that's just something to have on your screen just for the next 6 weeks here. You know, for markets, like what I find is that, you know, Jupiter in Pisces can either be, you know, kind of euphoric in some situations. It's not always bad for markets. That's the interesting thing if you go back and look at it. Or, however, it can also be associated with panic sell-offs. So, you know, as we know, like, you know, Pisces can be this kind of like higher spiritual transcendence of the self and the material world and kind of touching God. I guess that's more of the Neptunian modern astrology. Or it can be kind of a destruction of the self, right, through escapism and addiction and so forth and so on. And we see that in financial astrology. I found that it can often correlate with these kind of euphoric market rallies or these panic sell-offs. Now, in 2021 and 2022, it definitely was more going towards the panic sell-offs. So, you know, now the question again with tonight's retrograde ingress is, are we going to start to see a panic sell-off? Well, let me just show you something real quick here, guys. Things are not looking good. Just give me 1 second to line this up. I'm just going to go to my Twitter feed here, because I don't know, again, you know, I know I have a lot of financial astrology, you know, guys on here, and I know that's not Nick's specialty, so he's going to have to bear with me for a minute. We're having a tech rout here. Amazon was down 17% today, okay, on a slashed earnings forecast for a holiday sales slump. And then, you know, as we know, Facebook also took a huge hit, 20% down, wiping out like $100 billion. This is my Facebook feed. $100 billion of Mark Zuckerberg's personal wealth with Meta misses their forecast again. So Jupiter in Pisces hasn't even gone into Pisces yet, and we're already seeing huge sell-offs. Now, this may also relate to the lunar eclipse that's conjunct Uranus. Uranus is associated with big tech, cutting-edge futuristic technologies like social media, like Amazon, like cryptocurrencies. And so that may also be having some bearing on this. But so far, Jupiter in Pisces is not looking good for the markets. And of course, we're coming out of a short rally that we've had. But yeah, I don't know. I don't have a good feeling about Jupiter going back into Pisces personally. I think it was very difficult. In 2021, we saw the big Bitcoin crash from like $65,000 down to $29,000 in May, right on the Jupiter ingress. We saw like this protracted 2-week war in the Middle East between Israel and Gaza. We also saw stocks initially tank on that Jupiter ingress. Jupiter in Pisces in 2022 also brought us an epic stock market crash. I mean, okay, there were other factors, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. So I don't know. I don't know about Jupiter and Pisces. Theoretically, yeah, there should be something good there. It's good for spiritual exploration. It's good for spiritual growth. It's good for inner, the kind of deeper inner journeying and like inner internal dialoguing and analysis of our own inner journey, maybe. However, so far this hasn't really been, it hasn't been very enjoyable so far for the world. Now, of course, we can look at other alignments, Saturn, Uranus squares that have been ongoing, and the eclipses in Taurus on Uranus, like that's been challenging, because I think that's been a really challenging factor for 2021 and for 2022, right? Because the eclipses are like lined up with Uranus and Taurus. It's so disruptive. It's so hard to like get any stability right now, and it's just one disruption after another. So Nick, do you have any? I'm sure you have some different ideas and thoughts about Jupiter and Pisces, but that's just my little quick rant.
Yeah, no, I think I guess where I would break with you on this is I've seen Jupiter in Pisces have plenty to do with wealth transference, and sometimes growth. And there are a number of pretty rich people who have natal Jupiter in Pisces. Richard Branson is someone who comes to mind off the top.
Sure,
of my
and
head.
I mean, like there have been periods where Jupiter in Pisces was very good for markets and the economy. So don't get me wrong. I'm really only just talking about the previous two iterations of this stay in Pisces.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, well, definitely when Jupiter and Pisces were in Pisces together when Jupiter and Neptune were in Pisces together in the 1850s, the last time around, that was no picnic economically either, So, insofar as we've ever been able to track those two planets in modern times, we're nil for nil. But something to, my feeling is that it has something to do with the two planets being there.
Yeah, and actually, just to tie it into the Russian thing, a lot of people were hoping Jupiter and Neptune together would be this kind of golden spiritual moment. But what I saw was like, Putin's coming back to Putin's delusional aspirations of, dissolving the Ukraine as a national country. Jupiter and Pisces can be very fantasies that are unmoored from reality.
Well, the thing is, I mean, there is a spiritual element to all this. You have to remember, the Russians are Eastern Orthodox. They are sort of latter day, it's Moscow's the third Rome. They are the latter day Byzantines, if you will. When Constantinople fell, this was a tragedy to them. Because they lost, it's like the fall of Rome to them, literally. And Russian expansion, whether it's in the Black Sea or plugging those gaps that armies always invade through, the Bessarabian Gap, the Polish Gap on the Vistula River, all those things. They've always wanted sort of to be able to sail their navy right through the Dardanelles out into the Mediterranean and dominate the world. The British spent the whole 19th century trying to prevent that from happening. But the Russians, especially, and remember, Putin reconnected Russia with the Orthodox Church. The Soviets had sort of banned it. When I visited Moscow in 2016, we went into that big cathedral that, you remember the Pussy Riot sort of fiasco?
Yeah.
We went into that cathedral, but what I hadn't realized, and I kind of understood, even though I'm on Pussy Riot's side, why it was so sacrilegious. It wasn't just that they went into any old cathedral and did that. This was one that Stalin had destroyed in the 1930s. He had reduced it to rubble, and in the 1990s, with the resurgence of the church, they built this church to spec as it had always been. Like, imagine after 9/11 if they had just rebuilt the Twin Towers perfectly, just as they had been. Although I'm not going to compare a cathedral to the Twin Towers, but the same kind of idea, to really restore something that had been taken from them. And that the whole aspiration of Russia, insofar as like it's a political alliance with the Orthodox Church, the idea ultimately is to take Constantinople back. And you can, so if you want to
Wow,
talk
okay.
about, spiritual fantasies and these kinds of things, so, just because it's not your spirituality doesn't mean there isn't something deeply spiritual
Mm.
connected to the time and the motives behind certain things that are done.
Well,
And
Jupiter will be within a few degrees of Neptune, and that certainly, is favorable for spirituality, for spiritual growth, for things like meditation retreats, sacred plant medicines, and I think all kind of all
East,
spiritual
Eastern,
activities.
remember the Eastern Orthodox Church, they use a lot of incense. So, you go in there and the guy's swinging that whole thing. So, yeah, remember, just because it's not your church, it's still,
Right. Well, Putin is he's kind
and
of co-opted the church,
yes, yeah,
to support this war. And I mean, also the
absolutely.
same thing in the Ukraine. Like, I think during the Maidan protests, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was like taking in the rioters and the protesters against the
Yeah,
pro-Russian, police.
yeah,
So there is that spiritual religious kind of war going on there between the two countries as well. But
yeah.
just more generally speaking, I mean, I think that Jupiter and Pisces, and aside from the Russian thing, it is obviously widely seen as favorable for spiritual endeavors. But of course, it can also be maybe, there is that danger of straying into delusion and fantasy and cults. We definitely could see the rise of kind of cult groups and cult leaders during that time, because it's a very fanatical almost quality to it
Sure,
spiritually.
sure.
So that's going to be, Jupiter will be in Pisces until December 20th. Is there any
Yeah.
other, like, anything else that you're looking at in terms of mundane astrology that you think is really interesting about that stay in Pisces?
Um, well, I mean, it is really brief. But the fact that it's stationing,
Mm.
still there in those, in the mid 20 degrees. Where does it station? 27,
28,
28, 28,
28, 40
which is
something.
not too far, from where Mars stationed retrograde. It's not too far from where Mercury just stationed retrograde a couple of weeks ago at 25 Virgo.
Yes, and it will station on the same day as the Sagittarius new moon.
Yeah. So there are a lot of things happening in that sort of that last decan of the mutable signs, with Neptune being there, with Jupiter going there, with Mars having stationed in Gemini, with Mercury having stationed direct in Virgo recently. There's a train of events, a cycle of events that are all sort of linked together, most likely, and connected by that series of stations, and that all are squaring or opposing each other.
Yeah, so there's definitely some unfinished business here with Pisces, right? This is our chance to kind of like finish up whatever was started, in that stay in May through July of 2021, right? Which was the kind of initiation of Jupiter in Pisces. It went back into Aries for about 6 months. Excuse me, it went back into Aquarius for about 6 months. And then it made that entire transit of Pisces in the first 4 months of 2022. And then it went into Aries, right, where it's been since May. So now tonight it's going back into Pisces. And so in our own personal charts, we can look at, what houses are going to be affected and what the planetary aspects are from Jupiter, because those will be
Yeah.
quite significant. And that will tell us what kind of, there's some unfinished business. I think when a planet retrogrades back into a sign that it's been previously, there's some unfinished business that needs to be taken care of. And what that is will depend on our own personal charts. And for the world as well, I think there's some unfinished business here that needs to be attended to. Exactly what that is, well, we'll find out over the next 6 weeks. Certainly, with the election, that will also be just yet another
Yeah.
factor to consider. That's
Yeah.
that's a reversal. That is a reversal when Jupiter's changing signs backwards. So, man, I know we've been already talking here for about 45 minutes or so. Do you want to take a stab at Mars retrograde before we wrap it up? Do you have any strong thoughts or feelings or opinions on this upcoming event?
Yeah, the Mars retrograde in Gemini, what it ultimately winds up doing is it makes things happen very, very quickly. After a long period, like after a long sort of sludge of trying to, roll a rock up a hill, it suddenly there's a momentum that goes with it.
That's really interesting. Isn't that a kind of opposite of the sort of, I mean, I remember you saying that on the astrology podcast, and I was thinking, wait, Mars retrograde speeds things up?
Oh yeah, yeah.
See, I think of Mars, I think of Mars retrograde as like kind of like, this kind of headwind.
Yeah, no, I mean, what's really happening is the planet is visible in the sky, and especially when it makes a station. When a planet makes a station, it's like it's saying, "Hey, look at me! I'm about to show you what I do." And so it really is, the planet really sort of comes alive. I mean, this is why Mercury retrogrades are chaotic. Because Mercury is about sort of things, about the constant changeability of things, and when it goes retrograde, it's just like it's that much more mercurial. And Venus retrogrades are very seductive, and they bring those Venusian areas to the surface. When planets go retrograde, they're visible in the night sky, and they're showing you their stuff. They're doing their thing. It's very much going to be. I know you're thinking of the motion. You're thinking of the fact that it changes direction, that it's slowing in speed as it stops to its stations, and there's all this variant, and that does play into the whole visual element of the retrograde. But what's really happening ultimately is the planet is visible in the night sky and showing you its stuff, showing you what it can do, what it's all about.
Well, that's a good point. That first of all, that when a planet stations, first of all, regardless of direction, it's like the signal of that planet is turned up louder. Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
That's the energy of that planet is much more strongly felt on the days around the station. So that's one thing to just establish. Now Mars retrograde is actually one of the rarer retrogrades. It only happens once every like two years or 2.5 years or whatever. Could you just give us like the 2 years and 2 months? Thank you. Could you give us like we all know like what Mercury retrograde, like technical snafus, communication problems, travel delays. Could you give us like just a basic delineation for sort of like Mars retrograde?
Yeah, the big thing to understand with Mars retrograde is that it's a very asymmetrical cycle. Mars retrogrades in Cancer, Leo, and Virgo occur regularly every 15 to 17 years. But Mars retrogrades in Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces take 32 to 47 years to make a retrograde in that sign. So in other words, excuse me again, Aquarius is a sign that gets the smallest amount of tension from Mars. Leo is the sign that gets the most attention from Mars. Just proportionately, you're going to have far more people in the world who have Mars in Leo than have Mars in Aquarius. And this may be even, part of what makes a sign. Maybe part of what makes Leo is the fact that it gets regular attention from Mars as opposed to Aquarius. We had a Mars retrograde Aquarius in 2018. That was the first one since 1971, 47 years. The Mars cycle, it operates in this really weird rhythm where it's alternate returns of 15 and 17 years. So the first return is at 15 years, but then the next one is 17 years later at 32. And then the next one is 15 years later at 47. And the next one is 17 years later at 64. And then the next one is 15 years later at 79. And 79 years, you might remember Biden had his 79th birthday last year. And on a 79th solar return, Mars will be about 3-4 degrees from the natal Mars. It's the closest you get to a really perfect sort of synodic Mars return in a given human lifetime. And then the returns at 32 and 64, those are multiples of 8, and that's when the Mars and Venus cycle come and merge together. Mars retrogrades in Gemini are quite rare. They're not as rare as Mars in Aquarius, but they're more rare than Mars in retrogrades in Leo or what have you.
Wow. Interesting information. Now we know why they
Recent-
call you the human ephemeris.
Now they know, if they didn't know already. The last time Mars was retrograde in Gemini was 1990. It retrograded into late Taurus. This was just before the first Gulf War. Prior to that, there was a Mars retrograde in Gemini in 75, 76. It went from Cancer into late Gemini. But still, like the one in Gemini that we're having now, and like from 25 to 8 degrees, yeah, it doesn't come around very often, just, maybe a few times in a human lifetime. So people who have Gemini rising, I get all kinds of people who come to me
Right here
for
Gemini
consultations.
rising.
Oh, you have Gemini rising.
Yeah, 2 degrees, 2 degrees, and Gemini moon at 15. So
right. So if you have a 2-degree Gemini rising, that retrograde in 1990, I don't know what age you are. You look like you're about my age. I can surmise that the only time in your life you ever had Mars retrograde cross your ascendant was in the autumn of 1990. And you can go back and double check that. But that would be so think about that. We as astrologers, we're fascinated by the transits of the outer planets, because you just get that once in a lifetime Pluto transit or that once in a lifetime Neptune transit. But if you understand the Mars synodic cycle in this way, you realize actually that's a once in a lifetime Mars transit that you had back then. And then the one we're having now sort of echoes it somewhat. But for someone like you with Gemini rising, I would say, well, think if you're looking at your life now, wondering what the Mars retrograde might mean, think back to 1990, 32 years ago. And because that's about as close as we'll come in terms of, unless, the older folks like our parents or what have you, they might remember some of the older ones. There was one in 1958, for instance.
So Mars is, of course, the god of war, right? As we know, conflict, some of the things that are under, the purview of Mars, so to speak, right? Talking about Mercury retrogrades, travel, communication, and so forth. Mars, is anger, violence, war, conflict. Also, of course, sex and getting our needs met, getting our desires fulfilled. These are all issues that you may find they come up during the Mercury retrograde in some form or another. Now, the one thing I'll say about Mars and Gemini, I think is that, and one thing that I'm experiencing, now, and I have to say is words are very important right now. How you use words has the great power to cause harm or to cause healing. With Mars and Gemini, and especially about to go retrograde, especially on social media, of course, too, how we're using our words. I think we have to pay a little bit more special attention over the next couple months here.
To put Marshall McLuhan on his rear, the message is the medium. To set him on his back foot. For those of you media studies people. Anyway.
Indeed, yes. Terence McKenna used to quote that all the time.
Right.
And
with regard to Terence McKenna, born with Venus retrograde in Scorpio.
He was a friend of mine, actually.
Was he?
Oh, yeah. Right. I'm more of an acquaintance. I did meet him several times. He actually stayed at my house back in the late '90s, right before he passed away. But I was a big fan of his.
I hope he left you some nice gifts.
It was a very interesting experience. Yeah, he was a cool guy.
I can imagine. Yeah.
I met him several times, but yeah, so it's a whole other story. We can talk about that after the show. But
I was going to say, with regard to Mars involving war, I mean, certainly it involves what goes on in the battlefield, but Venus plays a very important role in war as well, because that's where the diplomacy happens. That's where the agreements happen. Venus is very much about the social consensus, about what we all agree the rules are. But it always comes up for review. That's what the Venus retrogrades are about. So, for instance, we had a Venus retrograde in Capricorn last winter, and suddenly, a border, something that everyone agreed was a fixed thing, there was a social consensus involving where Ukraine ended and where Russia began, and vice versa. That suddenly came up for review. And when all of this is settled, whether it's settled in a really horrible way or in a relatively harmonious way, it'll be settled with Venus, with talk, with sort of reasserting either reasserting the rules or reshaping the rules. But that's what happens with Venus. Venus is very much about the diplomacy involved in war, which is always just as important in the end.
Yeah, and for I mean, how do you see anything specific with this Mars retrograde affecting the war, other than a temporary winter stalemate or winter?
Right. Yeah, there was a Mars retrograde in Gemini during the Second World War. In 1943, there was a Mars retrograde in Gemini. That's why if you look at the charts of people like Jim Morrison or Keith Richards, who were born that winter, they have that Mars retrograde in Gemini in their natal charts. Wow. And that really was when the Germans were well and truly beaten, and all that remained was to sort of like, push them back. And it was in November of 43, during the Mars retrograde in Gemini, that Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt met up for the first time in Tehran to plan the what we now call the D-Day landing in 1944. Stalin was really desperate because he's fighting the Germans himself. He wants the Allies to come in and fight the Germans on a second front, and they put him off. It was supposed to happen in 42. It didn't. It's supposed to happen in 43. He's getting really mad, but it was at that point that they agreed, okay, next June during a full moon, so we can land by the light of the moon, and very close to a sun Venus Cazimi, actually, in June of 44. That's when that landing happened. So yeah, the Mars retrograde in Gemini was really sort of like, that was, everyone knew by that Mars retrograde in Gemini 43 that the Germans were beaten, even though it was going to take another year and a half to actually march into Berlin, and Hitler kills himself and all that stuff. But yeah, everyone who's not like insane, anyone who's realistic knows by the end of 43, okay, the Allies are going to win this war.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, because anyone who's sane now can see that the Russians are getting their asses kicked. I mean, nobody expected it to be this bad, so it's really interesting, what's happening. Yeah. So, but it may take another, whatever it is, 6 months, a year, or who knows how long, for the Russians to come to that conclusion. But that seems to be the inevitable outcome at this time. Of course, things can change. Again, for the financial astrology, that Mars, that long Mars square to Neptune is really concerning to me, because Mars is really important for like market confidence. When Mars is strong for existence, that, for example, that very long Mars in Aries, 6 months, I think 6 or 7 months it was in Aries, we got an amazing stock market boom, even with the retrograde. So, but this Mars square to Neptune is a very low confidence aspect of kind of, there's just a feeling of discouragement. In fact, there may even be a feeling of somewhat, hopelessness, I think. It's a bit of a slog. It's a drudgery aspect. It's difficult to see the way forward, actually. We may need to reformulate our goals and our strategies during this Mars retrograde square to Neptune. By January, hopefully we'll have a much clearer picture of how to move forward. And we may have different goals. We may realize that our old goals no longer really are suitable. We may realize that our goals are okay, but our strategies were totally ineffective. So I see the Mars retrograde as personally having to kind of reevaluate goals and strategies and desires and how we get our needs met, and those kind of things on a personal level. On the financial level, I think this, again, the square to Neptune, which I think goes exact somewhere around November 19th. After that, we'll see, what happens. I'm not really super optimistic for markets in general, but that's just another factor. So, all right, well, at least I think we covered a lot of ground here. Any final any final thoughts, or any classes or events, or anything that you wanted to talk about that you're doing in the upcoming?
Oh yeah, I'm about to release a video within the next couple of days on the Venus synodic cycle, sort of explaining my model. It's with sky images, and yeah, it's somewhat sophisticated. I'm
Cool.
excited about getting it out, and hopefully it
Cool.
really helps clarify. So when I come on and do these interviews and say things like blue 2 and red 5, people know what I'm talking about. I have explained it here and there. It's actually really easy to get if you have the diagram and in front of you and what have you. But I look forward to that, and
Awesome.
that is going to come along with I'm dusting off my Patreon account, which I opened but didn't really do much with a few years back when I was starting to plan out these videos. So I'll have a Patreon community and probably like a sort of a chat group on Twitch and things like that coming up. So
do you have a website?
Folks can check it. I do have a website, nickdaganbestastrologer.com. You can check out my website to see what I'm up to book consultations, to watch my videos if you don't want to go to YouTube for whatever reason, and or to just get in touch.
Awesome. Great. Well, thanks for joining me today. Nick and I have talked a lot over the years, just messaging. I've never actually met him or talked to him, so this was great to finally.
I didn't know what your face
connect.
looked like. I thought you looked like Johann Kepler until, or John Dee or whoever it is who's on your.
That's Nostradamus, actually. Yeah.
Oh, it is Nostradamus.
It
okay,
is
I know
Nostradamus.
it's, some old medieval guy with a beard. Yeah. Well, I'm sort of trying to look like those guys myself now.
Nick and I are both alums of the astrology podcast, so we have that in common, and we've both been on Chris Brennan's show. So, and Nick is often on the monthly forecast as well, so look for him on there, and he's done a lot of great episodes with Chris. You can of course find me at astrocryptoreport.com, and that has all my information for subscriptions, for my Patreon, for consultations and tutorials. My Twitter is astrocryptoguru, at astrocryptoguru. And I don't really have any, I don't have any big upcoming events. I'm about to release my November forecast report for stocks and cryptocurrencies with a special section on the USA midterm election and this very unusual and interesting, fascinating November 8th lunar eclipse in Taurus. I'm going to be talking a lot about that in my upcoming November report. And that's for subscribers only on Patreon and Substack. So go ahead and check that stuff out. Well, we talked about quite a lot today. We talked about Jupiter in Pisces. We talked about the Venus Cazimi cycle. We talked about Mars retrograde. We talked a lot about Putin and this unfortunate, terrible war in the Ukraine. We all hope that comes to an end soon. And Nick, thanks so much for joining me today. And I hope to have you back again. Your knowledge of, your historical knowledge of astrology is just incredibly impressive. I don't know anyone who is even remotely close to that in your knowledge and background about just the dates and the ephemeris and the astrological events. So thank you so much for that. And
thank you for having me.
Yeah, we'll see you guys next time. We'll do another video, and I'll do another video. I think I'm going to do one on the eclipses. I'm trying to get some more astrologers lined up. I'm not going to tell you who they are, and for the next couple episodes, I might do one just by myself. But we'll definitely do one on this November 8th midterm election and stuff like that. So be well, everybody. Have a fantastic week, and we will talk to you later.